The scent of aged paper and forgotten dust clung to Seth's study like a second skin. Stacks of illuminated manuscripts, digital tablets displaying ancient scripts, and meticulously organized printouts formed a labyrinth around his worn leather armchair. He existed in a perpetual twilight, the heavy drapes drawn against the relentless coastal sunlight, allowing only the glow of his monitors to illuminate the intricate dance of his research. For years, Seth had meticulously charted the forgotten tongues of humanity, a reclusive cartographer of dead languages, mapping the pathways of thought from the dawn of civilization. His current obsession involved the linguistic echoes between pre-dynastic Egyptian funerary texts and the pictographs of the Siberian Khanty people, a connection most academics would dismiss as lunacy. He traced a finger across a digital rendering of a papyrus fragment, its hieroglyphs depicting a procession of figures offering sacrifices. His focus, however, was not on the figures, but on a series of minute, almost imperceptible etchings in the negative space between two larger symbols. 3 short, vertical lines, followed by a single, slightly longer horizontal line, then a cluster of 5 dots arranged in a specific asymmetrical pentagon. He had noted it before, an anomaly, a curious embellishment he'd mentally filed under unusual scribe's mark. Hours later, the aroma of stale coffee pervading the room, Seth found himself examining a high-resolution scan of a basalt stele recovered from the banks of the Tigris. The cuneiform script spoke of ancient kings and battles, but there it was again, almost hidden in the texture of the stone, the identical sequence of 3 vertical, 1 horizontal, and the 5-dot cluster. Not quite a part of the cuneiform, not quite a natural imperfection. It was too precise, too deliberate. His brow furrowed. He cross-referenced the Khanty shamanic chants he'd been analyzing, looking for any visual analog in the translated transcriptions, any symbolic representation. The carvings were meant to invoke a protective spirit. He located the scanned images. Among the swirling animalistic forms, tucked into the curve of a stylized bear's paw, was the same pattern, undeniable. A prickle of unease began to replace his usual academic focus. The geographical and temporal gulfs between these cultures were immense. There was no known linguistic or cultural bridge that could account for such a precise, identical motif. Yet there it was, a recurring whisper in the cacophony of human expression. He felt the familiar thrill of discovery, a jolt of adrenaline that always accompanied the unraveling of a complex puzzle. But this time, it was laced with a peculiar coldness, like a draft seeping into the warmth of his study. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. He needed more data. His mind, a vast repository of obscure knowledge, began sifting through recent archaeological reports. He recalled a minor article published months ago in a regional journal detailing a new find along the coastal caves. A small team, working to stabilize sections of rock face exposed by recent storm erosion, had reported peculiar markings. He'd skimmed it, dismissing them as natural weathering patterns or perhaps very early, crude human attempts at art. Now a fresh memory surfaced, a low-resolution photograph accompanying the article, showing a section of damp, dark rock. He navigated his archives, the mouse clicking with a sudden urgency that felt alien to his usually methodical pace. The journal article loaded, its digital pages crisp against the dimness of his screen. He scrolled past geological surveys and carbon dating reports until he found the image. His breath caught, etched into the rough, damp surface of the cave wall, undeniably ancient, was the exact sequence. 3 short vertical lines, a slightly longer horizontal line, and the asymmetrical cluster of 5 dots. It was bolder here, larger than the subtle markings he'd found in the papyrus or the stele, but the design was identical. Seth stared, his mind racing, trying to force the information into a logical framework. Migration patterns, a lost proto-culture, but the sheer precision, the exact proportionality across such wildly disparate mediums, papyrus, basalt, bark, and now raw stone in the coastal caves, defied all known models of cultural transmission. This wasn't a shared myth, or a common artistic trope. This was a signature. He had found a connection, yes, but it wasn't one that spoke of human ingenuity or cultural exchange. This pattern, appearing across continents and millennia, felt foreign, alien to the very evolution of human thought. It was a language for something else, something that had left its mark long before recorded history, a deliberate, patient inscription woven into the very fabric of existence, waiting. He had stumbled onto something far grander and far more terrifying than a mere academic puzzle. He had, perhaps, just introduced himself to an architect, and the thought of what this architect might be, or what it might want, made the air in the room feel thin, suffocating. He would have to follow the pattern wherever it led. The dangerous path had just opened. The ideogram pulsed beneath Seth's gaze, a minute tremor in the otherwise static image of the basalt stele. It wasn't merely a symbol. He cross-referenced it with the Mayan glyphs from the Dresden Codex, then with the intricate knotwork of a Celtic manuscript. The superficial forms differed, but the underlying geometric relationships, the precise ratios of length to curve, the specific points of intersection, they were identical. A cold current ran through him, not of fear, but of profound intellectual awe. His research intensified, consuming him with a voracious hunger. The stale coffee in his mug became perpetually cold. Sleep was a forgotten luxury, replaced by short, fitful dozes in his desk chair, the glow of his monitors painting shifting patterns on his eyelids. He expanded his search beyond written texts. He scrutinized high-resolution scans of ancient pottery shards, the decorative borders of forgotten tapestries, the precise layout of Roman mosaic floors. He even found himself poring over astronomical charts from the pre-telescopic era, seeking the same intricate, non-random arrangements. The pattern wasn't just linguistic, it was structural, a fundamental blueprint recurring across disparate human endeavors. He found it in the specific arrangement of megalithic stones at a forgotten site in Brittany, their placement mirroring the ideogram's internal geometry. He discovered it in the deliberate, almost ritualistic spacing of pillars within a subterranean temple unearthed in Anatolia. It was in the rhythmic undulations of a pre-Columbian gold artifact, and in the seemingly arbitrary sequence of a medieval musical score he'd once dismissed as mere artistic flourish. Days blurred into a relentless continuum of data analysis. His eyes burned. He felt a constant, low thrumming behind his temples, a pressure that intensified with each new correlation. He began to experience fleeting sensory distortions, a persistent, acrid smell that wasn't there, the peripheral flicker of movement in an empty room, the faint echo of a resonant, deep tone that seemed to originate from beneath the very floorboards. He dismissed them as the inevitable toll of extreme exhaustion, pushing them aside with the same determined focus he applied to his work. His colleagues, when he rarely encountered them, remarked on his gaunt appearance, the feverish intensity in his gaze, but he brushed off their concern with curt replies about a demanding project. Yet beneath the surface of his rationalizations, a new sensation began to coalesce, an inexplicable sense of being observed. It wasn't a paranoid delusion of human surveillance, but something far more diffuse, more ancient. It was a subtle shift in the ambient pressure of the air, a prickle on his skin when he was alone, a profound stillness that seemed to permeate his office, listening. He felt, too, a strange compulsion, as if an unseen current was guiding his hand, drawing his attention to specific archives, particular indices, obscure footnotes he would have otherwise overlooked. Each time, these unwitting detours led him directly to another instance of the pattern. He had been focusing on a specific, recurring structural motif, a complex interlocking of three distinct geometric shapes within a larger frame. He had seen it in various forms, from decorative tiles to ceremonial objects. But as he overlaid the city plan onto the temple schematic, then superimposed a magnified image of the ideogram from the basalt stele, he saw it. The alignment was absolute. The city wasn't just built around the pattern, it was the pattern, writ large in stone and earth. Its very infrastructure a direct manifestation of the symbol. The realization was a devastating blow to his intellectual framework, shattering the bedrock of his understanding. The discovery ignited a frantic urgency within him. His gaze fell upon an ancient, fragmented nautical chart he'd been studying, a relic depicting a forgotten coastline. Marked on it, at a point where the land met the churning sea, was a unique, non-standard symbol, the ideogram. Subtly integrated into the cartography, driven by an impulse he could not deny, Seth traveled for 2 days, the journey a blur of impersonal transit hubs and rented vehicles. He found the coastline desolate, the sea a restless, gray expanse. The air grew heavy with the scent of salt and damp earth as he approached the mouth of the largest cave. Inside, the cavern swallowed the light, echoing with the rhythmic roar and hiss of the ocean. He moved deeper, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating ancient, water-worn rock formations. He ran his hand over the slick, cold stone, feeling for anything that might resonate with the patterns. Then he found them. Not carvings in the traditional sense, but faint, almost imperceptible grooves worn smooth by eons of water and wind, yet deliberately shaped. They formed the exact, complex interlocking geometry of the pattern, etched into the living rock. As his fingers traced the lines, a low, resonant hum vibrated through the stone, through his bones, a sound felt more than heard. The feeling of being watched intensified, became almost physical, a crushing weight pressing in from all sides. A vast, ancient consciousness seemed to stir slowly, ponderously, roused by his touch. He had not just found the pattern, he had touched its source, and something had just acknowledged his presence. He cross-referenced it with the astronomical charts, the Sumerian clay tablets, the meticulously documented etchings from a recently unearthed sarcophagus. The consistency was not merely thematic, it was structural. It was a singular point, a nexus. Seth leaned closer to the projection, his breath fogging the cool glass of the display. This wasn't a coincidence, nor was it a shared cultural symbol. The ideogram acted as a pivot, a constant factor in equations that otherwise yielded wildly divergent results. He saw it now, the underlying architecture. It wasn't a symbol of something, it was a symbol that acted. A key. His fingers danced across the holographic interface, pulling up more data streams. He overlaid the steel's ideogram onto a fragment of an ancient Akkadian ritual script. The script, once indecipherable, now seemed to ripple with a new logic. The ideogram wasn't just present, it dictated the grammatical structure, the very flow of meaning. It functioned like a prime directive, a foundational instruction. A shiver traced its way down Seth's spine, a cold sensation unrelated to the ambient temperature of his isolated research facility. This wasn't a language in the human sense, not one built on shared understanding or cultural evolution. This was a language that shaped the substrate of reality itself. A blueprint, the thought, once a fringe theory he'd entertained in moments of extreme fatigue, now solidified into a horrifying certainty. They were an active current, a living syntax embedded in the world. He scrolled through the Akkadian text, the once static cuneiform characters seeming to subtly undulate, their edges blurring and reforming. He blinked, rubbing at his eyes. The room's fluorescent lights, usually a sterile white, now possessed a faint, sickly green tint at their edges, like dying embers. He dismissed it as eye strain, a trick of exhausted vision. The text spoke of a great weaving, a chorus of stone and sky. Words that had once been poetic metaphor now resonated with a chilling literalism. The ideogram, the key, revealed that these weren't descriptions of events, they were directives, a set of instructions. And then, a new pattern emerged, a sequence of the key ideogram followed by 3 other, less common symbols. This sequence, when cross-referenced against the astrophysical data, pointed to a specific geographical coordinate, a precise location on the planet. His mind raced, a frantic kaleidoscope of possibilities. Why now? Why there? The coordinates led to a remote stretch of coastline, to a network of coastal caves known only to a handful of local fishermen and intrepid explorers. It was a place of raw, elemental power, where the sea carved relentless paths into ancient rock. Seth grabbed his worn field bag, stuffing it with a high-powered flashlight, a portable scanner, and a small, rugged tablet. The urgency was a physical ache in his chest. He had to see it, had to confirm this burgeoning, terrifying truth with his own eyes. The drive was a blur of highway and winding coastal roads. The sun, usually a brilliant orb, seemed muted, its light diffused through a sky that had taken on an unsettling, bruised purple hue. He told himself it was just cloud cover, a peculiar atmospheric phenomenon. But the subtle shift in color persisted, making the familiar landscape appear alien, as if viewed through a distorting lens. He parked his vehicle at the end of a gravel track, the air thick with the scent of salt and damp earth. The roar of the ocean, typically a soothing rhythm, now sounded like a hungry, guttural rumble. As he stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply. Water dripped from the ceiling, echoing like distant footfalls. The air was heavy, charged with an inexplicable energy that prickled his skin. He navigated the treacherous, uneven floor, following the coordinates displayed on his tablet. The damp rock felt oddly yielding beneath his boots, as if the very ground were breathing. He reached a cavern deeper than the others, a vast, circular chamber where the sound of the waves was muffled to a low thrum. And there, etched into the smooth, water-worn rock face, was the sequence. The key ideogram followed by the 3 other symbols perfectly rendered, precisely as he had deciphered them. It wasn't the wind nor the distant sea. It was a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone or sand sifting through an hourglass, but infinitely softer, closer. He activated his portable scanner, projecting the digital overlay of the sequence onto the cave wall. The congruence was absolute, but as the projection settled, the carved lines on the rock face seemed to deepen, to pulse with a subtle internal luminescence that defied the laws of physics. The black rock around the carvings shimmered, not with reflected light, but with an intrinsic, fleeting iridescence like oil on water. Seth reached out, his fingers trembling to touch the ancient symbols. The rock felt cool, but beneath his fingertips he perceived a faint, almost imperceptible vibration. It was not a physical tremor. It was a resonance, an active hum. His vision flickered, the carved symbols momentarily twisting into impossible geometries before snapping back into their familiar, unnerving forms. The very air around him felt thin, stretched, as if the fabric of the world had become taut, ready to tear. The ideogram from the basalt steel, with its specific arrangement of angles and curves, was not merely a symbol. It was a key. Seth had spent weeks dissecting its form, comparing it to the intricate numerical sequences he'd extracted from the Sumerian clay tablets and the astronomical charts. The consistency was not merely thematic. It was structural, a deeply embedded grammar. He saw it now in the meticulously documented etchings from a recently unearthed sarcophagus, a pattern so precise it transcended cultural boundaries, a language without human origin. A surge of exhilaration, sharp and potent, coursed through him. This was it. The grand unified theory of ancient communication, a Rosetta Stone for something far older than any human tongue. He had to share this. The academic world would be stunned. He drafted an urgent email to Professor Alastair Finch, a senior colleague known for his open-mindedness, outlining his preliminary findings. A week later, he sat across from Finch in the professor's cluttered office, a stack of printouts and digital tablets spread between them. Seth spoke with a rapid, almost feverish intensity, tracing connections between the glyphs, the numbers, the stellar alignments. He demonstrated the recurring motif, the specific angular relationships, the resonant frequencies he'd begun to detect through specialized acoustic analysis of the artifacts. Finch listened, his expression shifting from polite interest to a furrowed brow. Certainly ambitious, Finch began, his voice measured. But the statistical correlations, while intriguing, could be coincidental. Our minds are excellent at finding patterns, even where none truly exist. Seth felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. It's beyond coincidence, Professor. The structural integrity, the way these elements interlock across disparate cultures and millennia. It's a system, a language. Another colleague, Dr. Elena Petrova, joined them, invited by Finch for a fresh perspective. Elena, an expert in comparative mythology, skimmed Seth's presentation. "I see a fascinating confluence of archetypes, Seth," he offered gently. "The celestial, the chthonic. It speaks to universal human anxieties and aspirations. Perhaps you're discovering a deep-seated cognitive architecture rather than an extraterrestrial one." His gaze held a flicker of something Seth couldn't quite place, not disbelief, but a careful concern. He tried again, more forcefully, pulling up a new slide. "This isn't about human cognition. Look at the data from the deep-sea core samples. The same numerical sequence, embedded in geological strata predating Homo sapiens by millions of years. How do you explain that?" Finch cleared his throat. "Seth, you've been working extremely long hours. Your dedication is admirable, but perhaps a break is in order. You seem overtaxed. These are extraordinary claims, requiring extraordinary evidence, and frankly, the leap from ancient symbolism to pre-human language is a significant one." The dismissal was polite, almost paternal, but it stung. They weren't seeing it. They couldn't see it. He gathered his materials, the weight of the tablets suddenly oppressive. Their well-meaning skepticism felt like a barrier, a thick, soundproof wall erected between him and the truth he held. He retreated. His apartment, once a sanctuary of study, became a bunker. He disconnected his phone, ignored emails, and the world outside his windows blurred into an irrelevant backdrop. The patterns, the language, demanded his complete attention. The distortions began subtly, then escalated. A heavy tome on his desk, left open to a specific page, would invariably be found closed or shifted inches to the left, despite his certainty of its original position. He'd rationalize it. Fatigue, an overactive imagination, the subtle tremors of the old building. He started meticulously documenting the shifts, drawing chalk lines around objects, marking their positions. The chalk lines were always broken. They were not words, not precisely. A low hum that resolved into something like a sigh, then a murmur. They seemed to taunt him, not with specific phrases, but with a sense of immense, ancient amusement at his efforts, at his frantic attempts to grasp something so far beyond his comprehension. The damp, salt-laced air, the rhythmic crash of waves against ancient rock, offered a stark contrast to his apartment. Here, he felt closer to the raw, untamed elements, a primal canvas for his work. He set up a makeshift table, powered by a portable generator, surrounded by his charts and artifacts. The isolation was profound, absolute, but the entity's presence followed. The cave walls, rough and pitted, seemed to breathe. He saw glyphs in the patterns of lichen, heard the resonant frequencies in the spray of the waves. He knew, with a terrifying certainty that bypassed all rational thought, that this was not stress, not sleep deprivation, not hallucination. It was real, and it was here, with him, waiting. The coastal caves breathed a damp, saline air, a stark contrast to the sterile quiet of the research facility. Seth preferred this raw environment, the rhythmic crash of waves against the rock face, providing a visceral counterpoint to the abstract complexity of his work. He had brought the tablets, the reconstructed fragments of the metallic artifact, and his meticulously organized notebooks here, arranging them on a makeshift table fashioned from a smooth, sea-worn slab of rock. A portable lamp cast a stark, unforgiving light, illuminating the intricate carvings and his own increasingly strained features. The previous dismissal from the department head still resonated, a dull throb of intellectual isolation. They had seen only static, dismissed his connections as pareidolia, but Seth knew better. The patterns were too precise, too pervasive. He pressed on, his determination a cold, hard knot in his gut. He was close. He felt it, a tingling sensation behind his eyes, a humming in the very bones of his skull. He had initially interpreted them as an ancient astronomical chart, a record. But now, with the added context of the metallic fragments, a different possibility began to coalesce. He traced the lines with a gloved finger, his breath catching as a new translation clicked into place. It wasn't a description of celestial bodies, not entirely. It was a trajectory. A cold dread began to seep into his extremities. He re-examined earlier translations, the ones he'd thought described historical events or philosophical concepts. The rise and fall of civilizations wasn't a narrative, it was a phase transition. The Great Sleep wasn't a metaphor for death, it was a dormancy cycle. The language wasn't descriptive, it was prescriptive. The elegant complexity he had so admired, the intellectual challenge he had so eagerly embraced, began to twist into something monstrous. These weren't observations, they were instructions. They were a blueprint, and by deciphering them, by understanding them, he hadn't just discovered something profound. He had initiated a process. He had begun to execute the code. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. His vision blurred at the edges. He wasn't an observer, he was a participant, a tool, a key. He scrambled through his notes, his movements jerky, desperate. He found the fragments he'd dismissed as abstract poetry, lines he'd struggled to contextualize. Now they screamed with horrifying clarity. The resonance of the living current, aligned with the lunar arc, the focal point of the nascent mind, the turning of the gate. These weren't poetic musings on the nature of reality. These were components, ritualistic components, described in abstract, almost mechanical terms. The living current consciousness, the lunar arc a specific celestial alignment, the focal point of the nascent mind himself, his very act of understanding. His skin crawled. His entire life, his intellectual curiosity, his reclusive dedication to these obscure languages, it had all been a preordained path. He looked at the tablets, no longer seeing ancient wisdom, but a meticulously crafted trap. The symbols seemed to pulse faintly under the lamp's glare, no longer inert carvings, but active conduits. He was not just observing a language, he was speaking it. And in speaking it, he was not merely communicating, he was inviting. The coastal caves, once a refuge, now felt like the antechamber to something vast and indifferent. He had been so proud of his intellect, his ability to see connections where others saw only chaos. Now he saw the ultimate connection, his own unwitting servitude. The components had settled in Seth's mind, not as abstract theories, but as an undeniable blueprint. He saw the geometry in the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, heard the cadence in the distant city hum. His living space, once a sanctuary of ordered thought, began to reconfigure itself under an unseen, relentless directive. He started with the central rug, dragging it to a precise, calculated angle that seemed to hum with an unheard frequency. Books were not merely shelved, they became pillars, their spines aligned to form obtuse angles, their contents irrelevant, their physical presence paramount. A brass compass, a relic from his grandfather, found its place at the apex of a triangle formed by 3 heavy, leather-bound dictionaries. He moved with a meticulousness that was not his own, a precision dictated by the patterns that had taken root behind his eyes. The air grew thick, charged with an invisible pressure that made the small hairs on his arms stand erect. The arrangement was incomprehensible to any rational observer. A collection of pebbles, gathered years ago from a riverbed, were meticulously placed around a chipped ceramic bowl filled with rainwater. A silver locket, long forgotten, was suspended from a ceiling beam by a length of twine, swaying imperceptibly. Each object, each placement, was a node in a vast, silent circuit. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the exertion of a will that was simultaneously his and profoundly alien. The repetitive acts followed. He would sit cross-legged before the arrangement, eyes fixed on the swaying locket, and hum a low, resonant tone. It was not a melody he knew, but a vibration that seemed to emanate from his very bones, building in intensity until his skull thrummed. Hours dissolved. The light outside shifted from amber to bruised violet, then to the impenetrable black of midnight. Yet he remained, a silent, vibrating anchor in his transformed room. Sometimes he would rise, compelled to trace specific paths across the geometric floor, his bare feet adhering to invisible lines, his movements precise and unhurried. Each step, each hum, felt like a deliberate turning of a key in a colossal, ancient lock. The world outside the apartment began to lose its definition. The calls from a colleague went unanswered. The insistent knocking from a building manager faded into the background static of his own accelerating consciousness. The hallucinations, once fleeting shadows at the periphery, now asserted themselves with terrifying clarity. He saw shimmering fractals in the grain of the wooden floorboards, heard whispers in a language that was not sound, but pure understanding, echoing from the corners of the room. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched his own. One evening, as the lunar arc described in the ancient texts reached its zenith, an undeniable urge seized him. The humming intensified, pulling him towards the coast. He drove, the car an extension of his will, through deserted roads, the headlights cutting through a fog that seemed to thicken with every mile. The salt tang grew stronger, the roar of the waves a rising crescendo. He found himself at the mouth of the coastal caves, the ancient formations looming like colossal silent sentinels. The air was frigid and damp, carrying the scent of brine and decaying seaweed. The cave floor was slick with moisture, jagged rocks clawing at the dim light filtering from the entrance. He found a chamber, a natural amphitheater where the waves crashed with a deafening roar, sending spray high into the cavern. Here, he felt the true weight of the living current. He stood at the center, the cold water swirling around his ankles, the sea mist clinging to his skin like a shroud. He began the hum again, louder this time, a guttural vibration that seemed to merge with the roar of the ocean. The air crackled, the cave walls shimmered, then the world warped. The solid rock of the cave dissolved into a shimmering, translucent membrane. Beyond it, not the ocean, but an infinite, swirling tapestry of pure thought. Seth felt himself expand, his consciousness stretching beyond the confines of his body, beyond the cave, beyond the planet. He was a focal point, exactly as the text had described. He was a lens through which it could perceive, could begin to act. He saw it, not with his eyes, but with an understanding that permeated his very being. It was not a creature, not a being with form or dimension. It was a consciousness, vast and indifferent, a cosmic architect whose existence was a fundamental law, not a biological one. And humanity, all of humanity, was not a creation, not a species, but an intricate self-sustaining system, a nervous system, a vast distributed network of living currents, of nascent minds. And he, Seth, was not just observing, he was the synapse, the point of connection, the channel through which the architect could finally interface not just with the system, but as the system. The ritual was not for it to awaken, but for him to become the conduit. The revelation struck him with the force of a physical blow, stripping away every vestige of his former reality. He was not just a decipherer, he was a component, meticulously prepared, now fully activated. And the architect was not just waking up, it was beginning to think through him. The coastal caves beckoned with a cold, insistent draw. Seth felt it in the marrow of his bones, a hum that resonated deeper than the city's distant thrum, a cadence he now recognized as the very pulse of the patterns. He had driven for hours, the old vehicle's engine a monotonous counterpoint to the growing chorus in his mind. The air, thick with brine and the damp breath of the ocean, filled his lungs, tasting of salt and an undeniable inevitability. He parked the sedan on a gravel track, overlooking a rugged stretch of coastline, the waves crashing against ancient rock formations. The wind tore at his jacket, whipping his hair across his face, but he felt no chill. A singular purpose propelled him forward. He descended a treacherous, narrow path, the loose scree shifting under his worn boots, until the path opened into the maw of a vast cavern. Inside, the roar of the ocean muted to a deep, resonant rumble. The air here was cooler, stiller, carrying the faint, metallic scent of damp stone, and something else, something ancient and inert, yet expectant. Seth moved deeper, his gaze sweeping over the calcified walls, searching for the exact nodal point the patterns had indicated. His hand brushed against a smooth, water-worn stone, its surface cool beneath his fingertips. He felt the geometry, the inherent order of the cave itself, a natural echo of the abstract designs that now filled his perception. He found the spot, a natural amphitheater within the larger cave, where the light, filtering through a high crevice, cast a shifting, ethereal glow. Here the patterns coalesced, not just in his mind, but in the very arrangement of the rock formations, the subtle striations on the floor. He knelt, drawing a small bag from his pocket. It contained a collection of objects he had gathered over weeks, each chosen for its specific symbolic resonance. A shard of obsidian, a fossilized shell, a fragment of petrified wood, a polished river stone. These were not random curiosities, but components of a language, a grammar he now understood as intimately as his own name. With deliberate, slow movements, Seth began to arrange the objects on the sandy floor. Each placement was precise, dictated by an internal blueprint. He hummed softly, a low, guttural sound that vibrated in his chest, a sequence of tones he had extracted from the deepest layers of the deciphered patterns. It was a sound that felt alien on his tongue, yet perfectly natural, as if his vocal cords had always been meant to produce it. The hum deepened, resonating with the cave itself, the very stone seeming to absorb and amplify the sound. As the last object settled into place, a silence descended, profound and absolute, swallowing the distant ocean roar. The air grew dense, pressing in on him, a physical weight that bore down on his skull. His vision blurred at the periphery, the cave walls seeming to ripple, to breathe. The light above fractured into a million shimmering motes, each one a tiny, impassable geometry. Then came the connection. It wasn't a sight or a sound, but an overwhelming presence, a direct input to his consciousness. His mind expanded, stretched beyond the confines of his skull, beyond the cave, beyond the very planet. He was no longer Seth Thorne, the linguist. He was a point, a node, an infinitesimally small aperture through which a vastness poured. He experienced the entity not as a being, but as a fundamental principle, an architecture of existence so ancient and immense that life and death were irrelevant, fleeting concepts. He saw the universe as an intricate mechanism, its gears grinding across unimaginable eons, its purpose utterly devoid of meaning comprehensible to human thought. Galaxies were dust motes in its vast, indifferent currents. Suns were transient sparks. The revelation wasn't horrifying in a visceral, monstrous way. It was horrifying in its indifference. There was no malice, no intent, no sentience as humans understood it. There was only scale, a terrifying, absolute scale that rendered all human striving, all joy, all suffering, into an unobservable, meaningless tremor. Seth's sense of self, his memories, his identity began to fray at the edges, dissolving into this profound understanding. He was nothing. Everything he knew, everything he was a delusion, a brief, insignificant blip in a grand, silent operation. His perception of time fractured. Moments stretched into eternities, eternities compressed into heartbeats. His mind, once a fortress of intellect, shattered into a million fragments, each one reflecting a sliver of the incomprehensible truth. His hands were still outstretched, hovering over the arranged objects, but the purpose had drained from them. His eyes, fixed on the shimmering motes of light, held no recognition, no spark of the man who had entered the cave. The patterns were no longer a puzzle to be solved. They were the air he breathed, the stone beneath him, the fundamental, indifferent truth of all things. He was no longer Seth Thorne. He began to trace a complex, non-Euclidean symbol into the sand with a trembling finger, his lips moving in a soundless, endless hum. The coastal caves breathed a cold, salt-laced air, a steady exhalation Seth now understood as a fundamental resonance. He had moved deeper into the cavern, his headlamp beam cutting through the gloom, picking out the ancient striations on the rock walls, the water-smoothed contours. The hum, that pervasive, pattern-born vibration, had intensified here, becoming less a sound and more a pressure, a physical presence in the air, in his very bones. He felt the dissolution of his individual thoughts, replaced by an oceanic awareness of interconnectedness. He knelt by a tide pool, its surface a mirror reflecting the stalactites above, but also something else. Not a reflection of the cave, but a shimmering distortion, a ripple that defied the still water, a transient geometry that pulsed with an internal light. This was it, the nexus, the point where the patterns converged, where the static coalesced into pure information. Seth reached out, his fingers trembling not from fear, but from the overwhelming proximity to a truth too vast for his mind to contain. His hand plunged into the cool water, and the surface rippled not outwards, but inwards towards his palm. A sudden, terrifying download of pure data, devoid of language, devoid of human context. It was the pattern, unmediated, unfiltered. His mind reeled. He saw the universe as a singular, crystalline structure, humanity a fleeting, microscopic dust motes on its surface. He saw the cosmic architect not as a being, but as the very principle of existence, an indifferent, eternal geometry that simply was. His research, his meticulous deciphering, had been an act of turning a key in a lock he never should have found. He wasn't merely observing the patterns. He was becoming a conduit, a receptor for its silent, vast symphony. The patterns weren't symbols to be read. They were the fabric of reality itself, momentarily revealed through the thin veil of human perception. And now the veil was gone. Seth felt his consciousness stretch thin and then snap not into darkness, but into an unbearable, infinite light. He saw the entirety of time, the grand design, the insignificance of everything he had ever held dear. The pressure mounted, crushing his sense of self, replacing it with an overwhelming, alien logic. His body shuddered, then went still, his hands submerged in the tide pool, his eyes wide, staring at nothing, seeing everything. Weeks later, a search party located Seth's vehicle, abandoned on a remote track leading to the coastal caves. The old sedan, caked in sea spray and dust, offered no clues beyond his identification. A more extensive search, involving local authorities and a specialized recovery team, eventually led to the cavern. He was found in the deepest chamber, curled on the damp rock floor beside a small tide pool, his eyes open, unblinking. His skin was pale, his limbs stiff, but there was no discernible injury. The lead investigator, a burly woman with a weary face, knelt beside him, her gaze sweeping the cavern. "Find anything else?" she asked into her radio, her voice echoing unnaturally in the vast space. A junior officer emerged from a side passage, carrying a waterproof satchel. His research materials supervisor, he was found them in a makeshift camp further back. Notes, diagrams, some photographs. Back at Seth's isolated residence, The collected materials were spread across a long table in the makeshift evidence room. A forensic analyst, a meticulous woman with sharp, observant eyes, carefully examined the contents. There were notebooks filled with Seth's distinctive, precise script, intermingled with complex fractal-like diagrams that seemed to shift and reconfigure under the harsh overhead lights. Pages of ancient text transcriptions, astrological charts, and geological surveys were cross-referenced with lines drawn in a vibrant, almost luminous blue ink. "It's intricate," the analyst murmured, adjusting her spectacles. "But it doesn't make any sense. No discernible language, no consistent logic. It's like a cipher without a key, but even the ciphers are broken." She felt a dull throb behind her eyes, a familiar sensation she dismissed as fatigue from long hours. But today it was persistent, accompanied by a vague sense of unease. He glanced at a photograph of an ancient rock carving, its patterns strikingly similar to the blue lines Seth had drawn in his notes. A subtle tremor ran through her. Later that week, while reviewing the case files, the lead investigator found herself sketching absent-mindedly on a notepad during a tedious conference call. She drew a series of interconnected lines, a pattern that felt both familiar and unsettlingly new. She paused, staring at the small doodle. It was one of Seth's patterns, an exact replica of a symbol he'd seen in his notes, almost unconsciously reproduced. Across the city, a junior officer, assigned to catalog Seth's personal effects, experienced a sudden, inexplicable dizziness while handling a simple ceramic mug from Seth's kitchen. The horror had not ended. It had merely found new eyes through which to observe, new minds through which to resonate. Seth was gone, a silent sentinel in a coastal cave, but the patterns he had awakened had begun to spread, like a silent, indifferent infection across the very fabric of reality.